There are few legends in any dimension more terrible than that of the one called the Doomslayer. For 10,000 years, he has waged war against the denizens of hell itself, not as a mortal man driven by rage, but as something far more dangerous. The Seraphim's blessing had transformed him beyond the limitations of flesh and bone, beyond the need for rest or sustenance, beyond the reach of doubt or despair. He had become vengeance incarnate, sustained by the argent energy that coursed through his praetor suit like liquid fire through his veins. In the depths of hell's countless domains, his name had become a whispered curse among demons. They spoke of the green-armored giant who knew neither mercy nor fatigue, whose fury burned hotter than the flames of their infernal realm. Each demon he destroyed fed his strength, their essence absorbed into his being through the forbidden ritual that had made him more than human. The divinity machine's gift was not merely power, but the terrible certainty that his crusade would never end. Not while evil drew breath in any dimension. The fortress spires of hell trembled at his approach. Archdemons that had terrorized mortals for millennia fled before his advance like shadows before a blazing sun. His shotgun thundered through corridors of bone and brimstone, each blast scattering demon essence to the howling winds. His chainsaw roared through the screaming multitudes, its blessed teeth severing the connection between spirit and form with mechanical precision. Yet for all his victories, for all the countless hordes he had reduced to ash and memory, the Slayer had begun to sense something else stirring in the spaces between spaces. It started as whispers at the edge of perception, voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech. Not the crude bellowing of hell's denizens, but something older, more insidious. These were not the voices of demons bound to a single realm, but entities that dwelt in the very fabric of reality itself. They carried promises not of destruction, but of corruption. Not of death, but of transformation into something worse than death. The Slayer had felt their attention like ice against his soul, and he knew that his war was about to expand beyond the boundaries of hell itself. The moment of revelation came in the deepest pit of the Necravol, where demon forges churned out fresh horrors for the armies of darkness. The Slayer stood among the wreckage of 1,000 slain demons, his armor gleaming with their scattered essence, when he felt it. A tear in the fabric of reality itself, barely perceptible, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Through that invisible wound bled a corruption that made hell's evil seem almost pure by comparison. This was malice, refined to its absolute essence, hatred given form and purpose beyond anything the demons of this realm could comprehend. He approached the dimensional weakness with his weapons raised, expecting another demon ambush or perhaps a trap laid by one of hell's overlords. Instead, he found something that challenged his understanding of evil itself. The air shimmered with psychic energy that tasted of madness and despair, of hope twisted into anguish and love transformed into obsession. This was not the straightforward malevolence of hell, but something that sought to corrupt rather than destroy, to twist rather than annihilate. It was evil that wore the mask of salvation, darkness that promised enlightenment, chaos that claimed to offer transcendence. The Slayer's enhanced senses could perceive the dimensional barrier that separated this realm from whatever lay beyond. It pulsed with unnatural colors that had no names, resonated with frequencies that spoke directly to the primitive fear centers of the human brain. Yet beneath the alien horror of it, he could sense something else. Suffering on a scale that dwarfed even hell's cruelties. Not the clean agony of physical torment, but the twisted anguish of souls corrupted against their will, transformed into willing servants of their own damnation. His grip tightened on his weapon as understanding flooded through him. This was not merely another realm of evil to be purged, but a cancer that fed on the very essence of sentient thought itself. Every emotion, every dream, every hope, and fear of thinking beings became fuel for this dimension's hunger. It was a realm that grew stronger with each passing moment, fed by the collective unconscious of an entire galaxy. And now it had noticed him in return. The psychic pressure intensified as entities beyond the barrier turned their attention toward the dimensional weak point. They had sensed his presence, felt the burning purity of his purpose like acid against their corruption. Some sought to flee from his righteous fury. Others, more curious or perhaps more foolish, pressed closer to examine this anomaly that neither served their dark gods nor fell to their whispered promises. They found in him something they had not encountered in 10,000 years of feasting on mortal souls, an absolutely incorruptible will. The Doomslayer studied the barrier with the tactical mind that had served him through countless battles. His war against hell had taught him that evil, no matter how ancient or powerful, could be destroyed if one possessed sufficient determination and firepower. This new dimension presented a threat not just to him, but to every thinking being that had ever existed. It was not enough to contain such corruption behind dimensional walls. It had to be purged, cleansed with fire and fury until nothing remained but silence. He began to move toward the barrier, each step measured and deliberate. The demons that still lived in the surrounding chambers fled before him, their survival instincts overriding their hatred for the green-armored destroyer. They recognized what was about to happen, even if they could not comprehend its implications. The Slayer was about to do what no being had dared attempt in the history of the universe. He was going to declare war on corruption itself. The Praetorsuit's systems hummed with anticipation as argent energy surged through every circuit and servo. His weapons blazed with the accumulated power of 10,000 years of righteous slaughter. The Doomslayer had found his next crusade, and it would make his war against hell seem like a gentle prelude to the symphony of destruction he was about to unleash. The barrier between dimensions began to crack under the force of his approach, reality itself bending before the weight of his inexorable purpose. In that moment, as the first fractures appeared in the wall between realms, the Doomslayer made a choice that would echo across the galaxy. He would not wait for this corruption to seep into his own dimension. He would carry the fight to its source, tear through its heart, and silence its whispers forever. The hunt was about to begin anew, not in the familiar corridors of hell, but in a realm where thought itself had become weapon and shield, where the very act of consciousness was an invitation to damnation. The last thing the demons of hell saw was their eternal enemy disappearing into a rift that blazed with colors that had no earthly names, his roar of challenge echoing through dimensions as he stepped into the very heart of chaos itself. The Doomslayer had found his greatest hunt, and nothing in any realm would survive the fury he was about to unleash. The barrier between dimensions screamed as the Doomslayer forced his passage through its twisted membrane. Reality bent and buckled around him, the very fabric of existence straining against his intrusion like living tissue rejecting a foreign presence. This was not the clean transition between hell's domains that he had experienced countless times before, but something far more violent and unnatural. The dimensional wall fought him with a malevolence that seemed almost sentient, as if the boundary itself possessed a will to keep the realm separate. Behind him, the familiar fires of hell flickered and died, as the portal sealed itself with a sound like reality tearing. Before him stretched an impossible vista that challenged every notion of space and geometry that his enhanced mind could process. This was not merely another dimension, but a realm where the very concept of physical law had been abandoned in favor of something older and more terrible. Colors that had no names in any language writhed through twisted space, while sounds that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to the soul echoed through corridors of crystallized madness. The Doomslayer's first step into the Imperium sent ripples of shock through the psychic medium that comprised this realm's foundation. His presence was like a stone cast into a pool of liquid thought, disturbing currents of emotion and desire that had flowed undisturbed for millennia. The warp recoiled from his touch, not in fear, but in confusion. Here was a consciousness that radiated purpose without doubt, fury without madness, determination without the corruption that typically accompanied such intensity. He was an anomaly that the realm's native inhabitants struggled to comprehend. Demons of the lesser orders materialized around him with the fluid grace of living nightmares given form. These were not the crude, physical monsters of Hell's legions, but beings of pure psychic energy clothed in shapes that reflected the darkest corners of mortal imagination. Some appeared as writhing masses of eyes and teeth that spoke in voices like breaking glass. Others took forms that shifted between beauty and horror, their appearances changing with each heartbeat to reflect the observer's deepest fears and desires. All of them paused in bewilderment as they encountered something that defied their understanding of how consciousness should function. The first demon to approach him was a creature of Tzeentch's lesser court, a thing of ever-changing flesh that delighted in complexity and paradox. It spoke in languages that rewrote themselves as the words left its shifting mouth, offering bargains and revelations in exchange for the Slayer's service. The daemon promised knowledge that would make him a god among mortals, wisdom that would unlock the secrets of existence itself, power that would let him reshape reality according to his will. Its words carried the weight of genuine truth, for such beings could not lie in the traditional sense, only offer truths that led to damnation. The Doomslayer's response was delivered through the barrel of his combat shotgun. The blessed shells tore through the demon's form with an efficiency that sent shockwaves of disbelief through the surrounding warp currents. This was not the way such encounters were supposed to unfold. Mortals who entered the Imperium either fell to corruption within moments or were driven mad by revelations too terrible for finite minds to contain. They did not simply ignore offers of transcendence and respond with violence so pure it caused demons to discorporate on contact. More entities pressed forward, drawn by curiosity and the intoxicating scent of uncorrupted purpose. Bloodletters of Khorne manifested in crimson fury, their brass blades gleaming with the accumulated rage of 10 million battles. These creatures understood violence in its purest form, reveled in the art of combat without purpose beyond the joy of destruction itself. They saw in the Doomslayer a kindred spirit, a being who existed solely to bring death to his enemies. Their approach was not an attack, but an invitation to join in an eternal dance of slaughter that would make both warrior and demon stronger. The Slayer's chainsaw answered their invitation with a roar that echoed through dimensions. The blessed weapon carved through their brass armor as if it were parchment, its sanctified teeth disrupting the psychic bonds that held their forms together. Each daemon that fell released a burst of pure warp energy that the Slayer's armor absorbed and converted to power, feeding his weapons and sustaining his strength. This was not the simple consumption of demon essence that had marked his victories in Hell, but something far more profound. He was not merely destroying these entities, but fundamentally disrupting the psychic patterns that allowed them to exist. Plague-bearers of Nurgle emerged from pools of corruption that bubbled up through the non-space of the warp, their rotting forms trailing clouds of disease that could kill with a touch. They moved with the patient certainty of entropy itself, secure in their knowledge that all things must eventually decay and return to the embrace of their patron god. The sickness they carried was not merely physical corruption, but spiritual rot that transformed hope into despair, love into obsession, life into undeath. They reached toward the Slayer with hands that promised release from the burden of existence. His flamethrower bathed them in purifying fire that burned hotter than any earthly flame. The blessed Prometheum consumed not just their physical forms, but the very concept of decay they embodied. Where the fire touched, the corruption simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, but negated at a fundamental level. The surviving plague-bearers retreated in something approaching panic, their slow certainty shattered by an encounter with something that refused to acknowledge the inevitability of entropy. The fourth type of demon to test him came from Slaaneish's realm of excess, beings of perfect beauty and terrible desire that promised pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. They spoke in voices like liquid silk, offered experiences that would make every sensation he had ever felt pale in comparison. These creatures understood that all mortals carried within them seeds of want and need, gaps in their souls that could be filled with the right combination of pain and pleasure. They reached toward his mind with tendrils of psychic seduction, seeking the key that would unlock his deepest desires. They found nothing but an absolute void where such weaknesses should have resided. The Doomslayer's purpose had burned away every want, every need, every desire, except the fundamental drive to destroy evil wherever it existed. The demons of Slaanesh recoiled, as if they had touched molten steel, their perfect forms flickering with confusion and something approaching fear. Here was a consciousness that offered no purchase for their corruption, a mind that had purged itself of everything except righteous fury. His weapons spoke in every direction now, cutting down demons faster than they could manifest. The rocket launcher's blessed warheads detonated with force that rippled through multiple dimensions, each explosion creating zones of stability in the chaos-touched space around him. His plasma rifle carved lines of absolute destruction through the shifting geometries of the warp, leaving trails of crystallized reality in its wake. The very air around him began to solidify as his presence imposed order on the realm of ultimate chaos. The lesser daemons fled before his advance, their alien minds finally grasping that this was not prey to be corrupted or enemy to be destroyed, but something entirely outside their experience. This was a force of nature given consciousness and will, a storm of vengeance that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or turned from its path. Word of his presence began to ripple through the psychic currents of the warp, carried by the screams of dying demons and the terror of survivors. In the deeper realms of the Imperium, ancient powers stirred as reports of the anomaly reached their attention. 4 entities of unimaginable malevolence turned their gaze toward this disturbance in their domain, each seeking to understand what manner of being could walk through their realm with such impunity. They had ruled the warp since before the first star ignited, had fed on the dreams and nightmares of countless civilizations, had watched empires rise and fall like waves upon an endless shore. Yet none of them had encountered anything quite like this green-armored destroyer, who treated their greatest servants as minor inconveniences. The Doomslayer pressed deeper into the Imperium, his path marked by the corpses of lesser demons and trails of stabilized reality. He could sense something vast and malevolent watching him from the shadows between dimensions, could feel the weight of attention that pressed against his mind like a physical force. The warp itself was beginning to respond to his presence, currents of psychic energy shifting to flow around him rather than through him. He was not merely an intruder in this realm, but an active force of change that threatened to disrupt the fundamental nature of chaos itself. His journey had only begun, yet already the very fabric of the Imperium was beginning to adapt to his presence. The hunt that had started in Hell's deepest pits would continue here, among entities that had never known defeat. The Doomslayer walked on through the maze of madness, his weapons ready, his purpose unwavering, his fury burning like a beacon of absolute clarity in the heart of ultimate corruption. The deeper realms of the warp stirred with purpose, as word of the anomaly spread through the psychic currents that bound the Imperium together. What had begun as curious probing by lesser daemons evolved into something far more deliberate and coordinated. The four great powers that ruled this realm of madness turned their attention toward the green-armored destroyer, each seeking to understand and exploit this unprecedented intrusion into their domain. They had dealt with mortals who possessed unusual resistance to corruption before, but never one who seemed to exist in a state of absolute immunity to their influence. The first to act with true intent was the Changer of Ways, the great schemer whose servants delighted in complexity and paradox. Horrors of Tzinch materialized around the Doomslayer in configurations that defied rational thought, their ever-shifting forms weaving patterns of causality that stretched across multiple dimensions. These were not the crude ambushes favored by lesser demons, but elaborate tapestries of fate designed to ensnare the unwary in webs of their own desires. The creatures spoke in voices that carried the weight of prophecy, offering glimpses of possible futures where the Slayer's crusade would end in victory beyond his wildest dreams. They showed him visions of himself, standing triumphant over the corpses of every daemon in existence, his weapons silent at last because there were no enemies left to destroy. They whispered of knowledge that would let him extend his protection to every innocent soul in the universe, power that would make him the ultimate guardian of all that was good and pure. The promises carried the ring of truth because they were truth, carefully selected fragments of possible futures that could indeed come to pass if he would only accept their guidance and wisdom. The Doomslayer's answer came in the form of his plasma rifle, its charged bolts carving through the complex geometries of fate with surgical precision. Each shot disrupted not merely the physical forms of the demons, but the very concepts of possibility they represented. Where his weapons struck, futures collapsed into certainty. Probability waves crystallized into absolute outcomes. The elaborate schemes unraveled like poorly woven cloth, their careful patterns reduced to random noise by the application of overwhelming force. The horrors retreated in something approaching panic, their multifaceted minds struggling to process an encounter with a being who simply refused to engage with the fundamental nature of choice itself. They had offered him everything he could possibly want, shown him paths to victory that required only the smallest compromises of his principles. Yet he had not even paused to consider their offers, had not experienced even a moment of temptation or doubt. His purpose burned so purely that it left no room for the subtle corruptions they specialized in spreading. Bloodletters of Khorne responded to this failure with characteristic directness, manifesting in vast numbers around the intruder who had dared to spill demon blood without offering proper worship to their master. These were not the lesser servants who had first tested him, but champions of the blood god's inner circles, warriors who had earned their place through countless eons of slaughter. They came not seeking to corrupt or convert, but to claim the Slayer as a trophy worthy of their patron's attention. His skill in combat had already marked him as a prize beyond measure. The demon champions formed a perfect circle around him, their brass armor gleaming with the reflected light of burning souls. They spoke in languages older than human speech, issuing formal challenges in the ancient traditions of honorable combat. Each warrior bore weapons forged in the heart of dying stars, blessed with the accumulated fury of 10,000 battlefields. They offered him single combat, the chance to prove his worth against opponents who had never known defeat. Victory would earn him a place of honor in their master's legions, an eternity of glorious battle without the burden of moral consideration. The Doomslayer responded by drawing his super shotgun and opening fire in every direction, simultaneously. The blessed shells tore through their perfect formation like a hurricane of righteous violence, disrupting their ceremonial positioning and reducing their formal challenge to chaos. He did not fight them one by one as honor demanded, but treated them as he would any other obstacle to be overcome. His chainsaw roared to life, carving through brass armor and demon flesh with mechanical efficiency that stripped all glory from the encounter. The surviving bloodletters fell back in confusion, their warrior pride shattered by an opponent who refused to acknowledge the sacred nature of combat itself. They had offered him the highest honor their kind could bestow, the chance to join the eternal war where victory and defeat were both forms of worship. Instead, he had treated their challenge as nothing more than another target to be eliminated. His approach to violence was so pure, so devoid of passion or rage, that it left no opening for their patron's influence to take hold. Plague-bearers emerged from pools of corruption that bubbled up through the floor of reality itself, their approach, heralded by the sweet stench of entropy, made manifest. These servants of decay moved with the patient certainty of natural law, secure in their knowledge that all things must eventually fall to the embrace of their nurturing God. They did not come offering corruption as a gift, but simply expressing the inevitable truth that even the mightiest warrior must eventually know weakness, sickness, and death. Their leader, a great unclean one whose bulk defied measurement, spoke in a voice like honey poured over rotting fruit. It offered the slayer release from his endless burden, peace through acceptance of his own mortality. The demon promised that surrender would bring not defeat but transformation, a chance to spread his protective instincts across the galaxy through the vector of blessed disease. He could become a guardian of sorts, watching over mortals by ensuring their suffering was gentle and their deaths brought wisdom rather than mere ending. The Doomslayer's flamethrower answered with purifying fire that burned hotter than the heart of a star. The blessed Promethium consumed not just the demons' physical forms, but the very concept of decay they embodied. Where the fire touched, entropy reversed itself, corruption became purity, death transformed into life. The great unclean one's bulk wavered and diminished as its fundamental nature was challenged by something that refused to acknowledge the inevitability of endings. The creature retreated through dimensions that folded in on themselves, its voice fading to a whisper of confusion and something approaching fear. It had offered the slayer the one thing that all mortals secretly desired, an end to struggle, a release from the burden of choice and responsibility. Yet he had met their gift with violence, so pure it negated the very foundation of their existence. His refusal to accept mortality had transformed him into something that challenged the natural order itself. The final test came from the servants of excess, demons whose beauty was so perfect it could drive mortals mad with desire. They approached not with offers of power or peace, but with promises of sensation beyond mortal comprehension. These creatures understood that beneath every warrior's armor lay a human heart capable of longing, of need, of wants that went deeper than the conscious mind. They reached toward his soul with tendrils of psychic seduction, seeking to awaken desires that had been buried beneath 10,000 years of warfare. They found nothing but an absolute void where such weaknesses should have resided. The Doomslayer's purpose had burned away every want, every need, every desire, except the fundamental drive to destroy evil wherever it manifested. The demons of Slaanesh recoiled, as if they had touched something beyond their comprehension, their perfect forms flickering with confusion and growing terror. Here was a consciousness that offered no purchase for their corruption, a mind that had achieved a purity they could not even properly perceive. His weapons spoke with renewed fury, cutting down the servants of excess faster than they could retreat to their patron's realm. Each shot, each blade stroke, each explosion created zones of absolute clarity in the swirling madness of the warp. The very air around him began to crystallize as his presence imposed order on the realm of ultimate chaos. Reality stabilized in his wake, creating islands of sanity in an ocean of madness. The four great powers of chaos withdrew their servants and turned their full attention toward this anomaly that had walked into their domain and challenged everything they represented. They had ruled the warp since before the first mortal drew breath, had corrupted entire civilizations, had turned the dreams of countless species into nightmares of willing service. Yet none of their traditional methods showed any effect against this green-armored destroyer who treated their greatest gifts as obstacles to be overcome through direct application of overwhelming force. In the deepest reaches of the Imperium, where thought became reality and will shaped the very fabric of existence, the Chaos Gods began to plan. This was no longer a mere curiosity to be examined and catalogued, but a genuine threat to their eternal dominion. The Doomslayer had demonstrated immunity to every form of corruption they possessed, had shown that absolute purity of purpose could exist even in the heart of their realm. If such resistance were to spread, if other mortals learned that the whispers of chaos could be simply ignored through sufficient determination, the very foundation of their power would begin to crumble. The hunt that had begun in Hell's deepest pits, that had continued through the dimensional barrier into the warp itself, now escalated into something approaching a cosmic war. The Doomslayer pressed onward through the maze of madness, his weapons ready, his purpose unwavering, his legend growing with every demon that fell before his righteous fury. Behind him, the four powers of chaos marshaled their strength for a confrontation that would determine whether corruption truly was inevitable, or whether absolute purity could exist even in the heart of ultimate darkness. The warp convulsed as four ancient wills turned their combined attention toward the anomaly that had dared to challenge their eternal dominion. For the first time since their ascension to godhood, the great powers of chaos found themselves united not in common purpose, but in common threat. The green-armored destroyer had proven immune to individual corruption, had shattered their separate attempts at conversion or destruction with contemptuous ease. Now they would test him against the full might of the Imperium itself, a coordinated assault that would either claim him or reduce him to scattered atoms across the psychic winds. The attack began with reality itself, turning inside out around the Doomslayer. The familiar laws of physics, already tenuous in the warp, abandoned all pretense of consistency as four different sets of universal constants began operating simultaneously in the same space. Gravity pulled in directions that had no names. Time flowed backward and forward in spiraling loops. Matter became energy, became thought, became emotion in endless cycles of transformation. This was not merely dimensional warfare, but an assault on the very concept of existence itself. Demons materialized from every angle of approach that geometry could provide, and several that it could not. Bloodletters charged through corridors of crystallized rage, while plague-bearers oozed up from pools of liquid despair. Horrors of Tzinch appeared in configurations that hurt to perceive directly, their forms shifting through mathematical impossibilities that rewrote the observer's understanding of shape and form. Demonettes of Slanesh danced through the chaos with movements that left trails of pure sensation in their wake, each gesture promising ecstasies that would drive mortals mad with need. The Doomslayer stood at the center of this maelstrom of malevolence, his weapons blazing in every direction as he met the multidimensional assault with overwhelming force. His super shotgun roared with authority that echoed across 7 separate planes of existence, each blast tearing through demon flesh and psychic energy with equal efficiency. The blessed shells carried more than mere physical force. They bore the weight of absolute conviction, the crystallized fury of a will that would not bend or break regardless of the opposition arrayed against it. His chainsaw carved through the geometries of madness with mechanical precision, its sanctified teeth disrupting the fundamental bonds that held demon forms together. Where the weapon struck, reality reasserted itself in small but growing zones of stability. The impossible angles straightened into comprehensible shapes. The paradoxical colors resolved into spectrums that mortal eyes could process. The contradictory physics settled into patterns that followed rational laws. He was not merely fighting the demons, but imposing order on chaos itself through the simple act of refusing to acknowledge its supremacy. The rocket launcher spoke with a voice like thunder given form, its blessed warheads detonating in cascades of purifying fire that burned through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each explosion created expanding spheres of crystallized reality that pushed back against the fluid madness of the warp. The demons caught within these zones of stability found their forms becoming solid, their psychic nature constrained by physical law, their immortal essence suddenly vulnerable to permanent destruction. They screamed as they died, not in pain, but in genuine terror at facing something they had thought impossible. True ending. As the battle raged across impossible battlefields, something unprecedented began to occur in the deepest currents of the Imperium. The Doomslayer's weapons were not merely destroying demons, but consuming their essence in a way that violated every principle the Chaos Gods understood about the nature of psychic energy. Normally, when a demon was banished from the material plane, its essence returned to the warp to eventually reform and manifest again. Death, for such beings, was merely an inconvenience rather than a genuine ending. But the Slayer's blessed armaments did something else entirely. They absorbed the psychic energy that comprised the demon's being and channeled it into his own systems, converting chaotic malevolence into pure purpose through a process that should have been impossible. His armor gleamed brighter with each enemy destroyed. His weapons gained power from the very beings they obliterated. His own presence in the warp grew stronger, even as the realm itself began to weaken around him. The four Chaos Gods felt the drain like a physical wound, a hemorrhaging of power that had no precedent in their eternal existence. Every demon that fell to the Slayer's weapons represented not just a temporary setback, but a permanent reduction in their collective strength. The psychic energy that had fed their realms for eons was being converted into something antithetical to their nature, transformed from corruption into purity through the simple mechanism of his unwavering will. Greater demons manifested to stem the tide of destruction, beings of such power that their mere presence could reshape continents in the material universe. Bloodthirsters of Khorne descended like crimson meteors, their whips of brass and flame carving channels through the fabric of space itself. Great unclean ones of Nurgle oozed through dimensional barriers, their bulk defying measurement as they brought entropy made manifest. Lords of change spread wings that cast shadows across multiple realities, while keepers of secrets moved with grace that turned violence into art and art into obsession. The Doomslayer met their charge without hesitation, his weapons adapting to match the increased threat through mechanisms that drew power directly from the enemies he faced. The plasma rifle blazed with energy that burned hotter than stellar cores, carving through demon hide that had turned aside the weapons of entire armies. His chainsaw roared with harmonics that disrupted the psychic bonds, holding the greater demon's forms stable, each rev of the engine sending ripples of dissolution through their carefully maintained shapes. The battle expanded beyond the confines of ordinary space-time as the combatants carved their conflict across the fundamental structure of the warp itself. They fought on platforms of crystallized thought, suspended over oceans of liquid emotion, battled through corridors where the walls were made of compressed time and the floors consisted of solidified paradox. The Slayer's presence created islands of stability in this sea of madness, zones where the laws of physics reasserted themselves and made genuine victory possible. His flamethrower bathed entire cohorts of demons in purifying fire that burned away more than mere physical form. The blessed Promethium consumed the very concepts the creatures embodied, turning hatred into peace, despair into hope, excess into moderation, and change into stability. The surviving demons fled before this weapon that attacked not just their bodies, but their essential nature, transforming them from embodiments of vice into echoes of virtue before finally reducing them to nothing at all. The tide of battle began to turn as the Doomslayer's growing power reached a critical threshold. Each daemon destroyed fed his strength. Each victory over impossible odds increased his presence in the warp until he stood as a beacon of absolute order in the heart of ultimate chaos. The psychic winds themselves began to flow around him, rather than through him, reality crystallizing in his wake as he carved a path of unwavering purpose through the maze of madness. The four Chaos Gods felt something they had not experienced since their ascension to divinity: genuine fear. This was not the temporary setback of a failed corruption attempt, or the minor annoyance of a particularly stubborn mortal. This was an existential threat to their very existence, a force that could potentially unravel the fundamental nature of the warp itself. The green-armored destroyer was not merely immune to their influence, but actively hostile to the concept of chaos in any form. They began to withdraw their forces, pulling back the demons that remained from what had become not a battle, but a systematic extermination. The Doomslayer pressed forward through the retreating hordes, his weapons speaking with voices that carried across dimensions, his fury burning like a star in the heart of darkness. Behind him, zones of stable reality spread like ripples on a pond, permanent alterations to the Imperium's structure that would persist long after he had passed. In the depths of their separate realms, the Chaos Gods convened in ways that transcended normal communication, their thoughts interweaving across the psychic medium of the warp as they assessed the magnitude of the threat they faced. This was no longer a prize to be claimed or an enemy to be corrupted. This was a force of nature that threatened to impose order on their eternal chaos, to transform their realm of infinite possibility into a prison of absolute certainty. The Doomslayer stood victorious on a battlefield littered with the remains of lesser and greater demons alike, his armor blazing with absorbed energy, his weapons crackling with power drawn from the very beings they had destroyed. The hunt that had begun in hell, that had led him through the dimensional barriers into the warp itself, now escalated into something approaching a cosmic war. He had proven that corruption was not inevitable, that chaos could be fought and defeated through sufficient application of purified will. The four powers of chaos retreated to their deepest sanctums to plan their next move, while the Doomslayer pressed onward through their domain, his legend growing with every step. The Imperium itself began to change around him, reality stabilizing in ways that had not occurred since before the first mortal mind had dreamed of gods and demons. The eternal war had found a new front, and for the first time in their existence, the Lords of Chaos were no longer certain of victory. Across the galaxy, in the cold realm of physical matter, where mortals lived and died beneath distant stars, the first ripples of the Doomslayer's war began to manifest in ways that defied explanation. The Imperium and real space were not separate dimensions, but two faces of the same cosmic coin, forever intertwined in a dance of cause and effect that bound the material universe to the realm of pure thought. What transpired in the depths of the warp could not be contained there indefinitely, and the systematic destruction of demon legions sent shockwaves through the psychic medium that connected every thinking mind in existence. Imperial navigators, those blessed and cursed souls whose third eyes allowed them to perceive the currents of the warp and guide humanity's ships between the stars, were the first to sense that something fundamental had changed in the Imperium's ancient patterns. They reported storms of unprecedented violence sweeping through regions that had been stable for centuries, psychic hurricanes that seemed to move with purpose rather than following the chaotic eddies that typically characterized warp phenomena. More disturbing still were the reports of something hunting in those storms, a presence that left trails of crystallized calm in its wake. The most experienced navigators spoke in whispers of corridors of pure light carved through the heart of darkness, paths where demon whispers fell silent, and the eternal screaming of tortured souls gave way to something approaching peace. These were not the familiar safe passages that their ancient charts mapped through the Imperium, but new channels that seemed to appear overnight and radiate a purity that made even the most corruption-hardened navigators weep with relief. Yet none could explain what force possessed the power to impose such order on the realm of ultimate chaos. Navigator houses across the Imperium convened emergency sessions as reports flooded in from every sector of the galaxy. Trade routes that had been impassable for millennia due to demon infestation suddenly opened as clear as highways through civilized space. Ancient warp storms that had raged since the dark age of technology simply dissipated, leaving behind regions of stability that allowed unprecedented speed of travel between distant worlds. The phenomenon defied every principle of warp navigation that had been accumulated over 10,000 years of imperial expansion. Chaos cults, hidden in the dark corners of 1,000,000 worlds, found their connection to their patron gods severed as if by a blade of pure light. Cultists who had spent lifetimes cultivating their mutations, who had sacrificed countless innocents to earn the favor of the dark powers, discovered that their prayers went unanswered, and their rituals failed to manifest even the simplest of supernatural effects. The whispers in their minds that had guided them toward damnation fell silent, leaving them with nothing but the echoing horror of their crimes and the terrible clarity of what they had become. Across entire sectors, chaos uprisings that had been brewing for decades simply collapsed as their supernatural support vanished, without the empowerment of demonic possession, without the promise of ascension through corruption, without the whispered guidance of entities that had seduced them into rebellion. The cultists found themselves facing the full might of imperial retribution with nothing but mortal strength and mundane weapons. PDF forces and Imperial Guard regiments reported victories over heretical forces that should have been impossible, triumphs achieved not through superior tactics or firepower, but through the simple absence of their enemies' supernatural advantages. On the throne world of terror, in the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace, where the Golden Throne maintained its eternal vigil, something stirred that had remained motionless for 10 millennia. The master of mankind, he who had once walked among mortals as conqueror and emperor, whose physical form had been reduced to little more than a desiccated corpse sustained by arcane machinery, felt the disturbance in the warp like a distant earthquake. His psychic consciousness spread thin across the galaxy to maintain the Astronomicon beacon that guided Imperial ships through the darkness, suddenly contracted as something unprecedented drew his attention. This was not the familiar sensation of demon activity or chaos corruption that he had monitored for 10,000 years from his place on the Golden Throne. This was something else, entirely. A presence in the warp that radiated purity so absolute it created zones of stability in the roiling chaos of the Imperium. The Emperor's vast mind, capable of processing the psychic emanations of trillions of human souls simultaneously, focused on this anomaly with growing fascination and something that might have been hope. The presence moved through the warp with purpose that reminded him of his own crusade across the stars when he had sought to unite humanity under a single banner and free them from the predations of alien and demon alike. Yet this was not a force of conquest or dominion, but something purer and more focused. It sought not to rule or convert, but simply to destroy evil wherever it manifested. The simplicity of its mission, the absolute clarity of its purpose, resonated with memories of what the Emperor had once hoped to achieve before the weight of necessity had forced him to accept compromises that stained his soul. In the corridors and chambers that surrounded the throne room, the Adeptus Custodes felt their master's attention sharpen for the first time in centuries. These golden-armored guardians, gene-crafted to be the ultimate protectors of humanity's greatest leader, possessed a psychic connection to their master that allowed them to sense his moods and intentions even when he remained silent. They had stood vigil for 10 millennia, watching over his still form as it maintained the systems that kept the Imperium alive, and they knew the difference between his usual brooding contemplation and this new, focused awareness. Captain General Trajan Valoris, Supreme Commander of the Custodian Guard, felt the psychic pressure emanating from the throne room like heat from a forge. His enhanced senses, honed by centuries of service, detected subtle changes in the arcane machinery that sustained their master's form. Power readings fluctuated in patterns that had not been recorded since the dark days immediately following the Horus heresy. The Golden Throne itself seemed to thrum with anticipation, its ancient systems responding to their occupants' increased activity, with mechanisms that had lain dormant for millennia. The Custodes throughout the palace reported similar disturbances to their Captain General. Guard captains spoke of dreams that were not dreams, visions of a figure in green armor, walking through storms of demon fire, with weapons that blazed brighter than stars. Shield captains reported sensing their master's psychic attention, turning toward something in the depths of the warp, a focus so intense it left after-images in their enhanced consciousness. All described the same underlying sensation, that after 10,000 years of stalemate, something was finally changing in the eternal war against the forces of chaos. In the depths of the Imperial Palace's archives, ancient servitors activated systems that had not functioned since the Great Crusade, as the Emperor's will touched mechanisms he had not employed for millennia. Cogitator banks hummed to life, their machine spirits awakening from eons of dormancy to process data streams that flowed directly from their master's consciousness. The information they processed defied classification, reports of demon legions simply vanishing from existence, of warp storms calming as if soothed by an invisible hand, of something walking through the immaterium that left order in its wake. The Emperor's psychic voice, silent for so long that many had wondered if he retained the ability to communicate, whispered through the minds of his most trusted guardians. The words carried weight that pressed against their enhanced consciousness like lead, concepts too vast for mortal minds to fully comprehend. He spoke of a presence in the warp unlike anything that had existed since the war in heaven, of a force that challenged the fundamental nature of chaos itself. His tone carried something that the Custodes had not heard in 10,000 years of service: anticipation. As the Doomslayer pressed deeper into the immaterium, carving his path of destruction through demon legions and leaving crystallized reality in his wake, the effects of his passage continued to ripple outward through both dimensions. In real space, Imperial forces found themselves winning battles they should have lost, while Chaos cultists discovered that their dark patrons had abandoned them to face the consequences of their crimes alone. In the warp, entire regions that had been dominated by demonic presence for eons were transformed into corridors of stability and light. The hunt that had begun in Hell's deepest pits, that had led the Doomslayer through dimensional barriers into the realm of chaos itself, now approached a convergence that would shake the foundations of the galaxy. On Terra, the master of mankind stirred on his golden throne and turned his attention toward the approaching presence with the intensity of a god recognizing a kindred spirit. The eternal war was about to gain a new participant, one whose simple purpose might tip the balance that had remained static for 10 millennia. In the corridors of the Imperial Palace, the Custodes prepared for something they could not name, but felt approaching with the certainty of destiny itself. Their master's psychic emanations spoke of change coming to the eternal stalemate, of a force that might finally break the endless cycle of corruption and resistance that had defined the galaxy for 10,000 years. The Doomslayer continued his relentless advance through the warp, his legend growing with every demon that fell before his righteous fury, unaware that his hunt was leading him toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of humanity itself. In the depths of the Imperium, where direction held no meaning and distance was measured in will rather than space, the Doomslayer felt the pull of something that cut through the chaos like a blade of pure starlight. It was not the corrupt radiance of demon fire or the false promises that emanated from the lairs of the chaos gods, but a beacon of power so fundamentally pure that it seemed to burn away the very concept of corruption wherever its light touched. This was not merely another psychic phenomenon to be analyzed and dismissed, but a source of strength that resonated with his own absolute purpose in ways that transcended rational understanding. The Astronomicon blazed across the warp with the steady brilliance of a star-given consciousness, its light carrying the accumulated faith and sacrifice of 10,000 years of human devotion. Every day for 100 centuries, 1,000 psychers had given their lives to feed this beacon, their souls consumed to maintain the psychic lighthouse that guided Imperial ships through the darkness between worlds. Their willing sacrifice had created something unprecedented in the Imperium, a source of power that remained utterly incorruptible despite existing in the heart of the realm where all virtue turned to vice. The Doomslayer recognized the nature of this light with the instinct of a predator identifying prey, yet what he found was not an enemy to be destroyed, but a kindred spirit blazing with righteous purpose. Here was power dedicated not to conquest or corruption, not to personal aggrandizement or the satisfaction of twisted desires, but to the simple act of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The beacon spoke of duty carried beyond the point of endurance, of sacrifice offered without hope of reward, of a will that had endured 10 millennia of agony to keep humanity's light burning in the darkness. He began to move toward the source of this radiance, his passage through the warp no longer the random wandering of a hunter seeking prey, but the purposeful advance of a warrior who had finally found a cause worthy of his absolute dedication. The currents of psychic energy that comprised the Imperium substance flowed around him, like water parting before the prow of a ship, reality stabilizing in his wake as his unwavering purpose imposed order on the realm of eternal chaos. Behind him stretched a trail of crystallized space, where demon whispers fell silent, and the screaming of tortured souls gave way to blessed peace. The journey across the galaxy through dimensions that existed parallel to real space revealed the true scope of the corruption he had dedicated his existence to fighting. Every sector of the Imperium crawled with demon legions that fed on the fears and nightmares of mortal minds. Every current of psychic energy carried whispers designed to seduce the unwary into damnation. This was not merely a realm where evil dwelt, but a dimension where malevolence had achieved such complete dominion that the very concept of good had become an alien intrusion that the environment rejected like a body-fighting infection. Yet as the Doomslayer carved his path through this maze of malevolence, following the steady pulse of the Astronomicon's light, he encountered evidence that resistance was not futile. Scattered through the deeper currents of the warp were souls that had refused to yield to corruption, despite being trapped in this nightmare realm for subjective centuries. These were the spirits of Imperial servants who had died in service to humanity's cause, pilots and navigators and crew members whose ships had been lost in warp storms, soldiers and civilians caught in demon attacks who had chosen death before dishonor. They existed as flickering points of defiance in the ocean of malevolence, their consciousness maintained through sheer force of will and the strength of their faith in the emperor they had served in life. The daemons tormented them with exquisite creativity, offering release from suffering in exchange for the smallest compromise of their principles, promising power and pleasure and peace if they would only acknowledge the supremacy of the Chaos Gods. These souls had endured torments that would have broken lesser minds within moments, yet they maintained their integrity even as their essence slowly faded from the constant strain of resistance. The Doomslayer could not save them, for their connection to life had been severed too long ago, and their spiritual energy had been stretched too thin by eons of defiance. What he could offer was something perhaps more valuable: vengeance against their tormentors, so complete and terrible that it would echo through the warp for eternity. His weapons blazed with renewed fury as he encountered each pocket of suffering souls, his chainsaw roaring through demon flesh, while his shotgun spoke with the voice of absolute justice. The demons that fled before his advance carried word of his passage to every corner of the Imperium, their terrified whispers spreading the legend of the green-armored destroyer who left trails of purified space wherever he passed. Greater demons that had ruled their domains unchallenged for millennia gathered their forces and fled to deeper realms rather than face the being who had proven capable of imposing permanent ending on creatures that had thought themselves immortal. Entire regions of the warp that had been demon strongholds for eons were abandoned as their inhabitants retreated before his relentless advance. As he drew closer to the source of the beacon, the Astronomican's light grew stronger and more complex, revealing layers of purpose and sacrifice that spoke of a will vast enough to encompass the protection of an entire species. This was not the simple fury that drove his own crusade, but something deeper and more nuanced: love for humanity expressed through willingness to endure infinite suffering for their sake. The light carried echoes of every soul that had fed the beacon, their individual voices joining in a choir of sacrifice that had sung for 10,000 years without faltering. The Doomslayer felt something stir in the depths of his consciousness that he had not experienced since his transformation in the divinity machine: recognition of a purpose greater than his own. His war against evil had been driven by fury at what had been done to his people, his crusade fueled by rage that burned hotter than the fires of hell itself. But this beacon spoke of a different kind of strength, one rooted not in anger but in love, not in vengeance but in protection, not in the desire to destroy but in the need to preserve. The psychic currents of the warp began to shift as he approached the Sol system, the chaotic eddies and whirlpools of malevolent energy giving way to something approaching order. The Astronomican's influence was strongest here, its light burning with such intensity that lesser demons simply could not manifest in its presence. This was the heart of the Imperium's psychic strength, the source from which humanity's defiance of chaos emanated across the galaxy. Here, in the realm where evil should have reigned supreme, good had carved out a sanctuary that had endured for 100 centuries. Terror itself blazed like a second sun in the depths of the Imperium, its psychic presence so overwhelming that the Doomslayer could perceive it from dimensions away. This was not merely the throne world of an empire, but the spiritual heart of humanity's resistance to the forces that would see them consumed or corrupted. Every prayer offered by Imperial citizens across the galaxy fed this beacon. Every act of courage and sacrifice by servants of the Golden Throne added to the light that kept the darkness at bay. He could sense something else now, a presence vast and ancient and unutterably weary that dwelt at the heart of the beacon's radiance. This was the source of the light that had guided him across the galaxy, a consciousness so powerful that its dreams shaped reality, and its nightmares could bring entire star systems to ruin. Yet despite power that dwarfed anything the Doomslayer had encountered in his 10,000 years of warfare, this entity radiated the same fundamental purity that had drawn him from the depths of hell itself. The warp around Terra pulsed with defensive energy as he approached, psychic barriers that had been erected and maintained for millennia, recognizing him as something unprecedented. These were not the crude walls of force that daemon princes erected around their domains, but sophisticated constructs that could distinguish between friend and foe at the level of spiritual essence. They tested his intentions, probed his purpose, analyzed his very soul to determine whether he represented a threat to the world they guarded. What they found was a will so absolutely dedicated to the destruction of evil that it left no room for corruption or compromise. The barriers did not dissolve but shifted, creating a path that would lead him not to Terra's surface, but to the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace, where the source of the beacon maintained its eternal vigil. The Doomslayer pressed forward through this corridor of light, his weapons at the ready, his purpose unwavering, his legend growing with every step that brought him closer to a confrontation that would determine the fate of humanity itself. Behind him stretched a trail of purified warp space that would endure long after he had passed, a permanent alteration to the Imperium's structure that spoke of the fundamental change his passage had wrought in the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Ahead lay Terra, the Golden Throne, and the being whose sacrifice had maintained humanity's light in the darkness for 10,000 years. The hunt that had begun in Hell's deepest pits was approaching its culmination, and the galaxy itself held its breath as two forces of absolute will prepared to meet in the heart of the Imperium's power. Terra blazed in the depths of the Imperium like a fortress of crystallized starlight, its psychic defenses layered in configurations that had taken 10,000 years to perfect. The throne world's protection was not a simple barrier, but a vast and complex construction of interwoven wards, each one built from the sacrifice and dedication of countless servants who had given their lives to keep humanity's heart safe from the predations of chaos. These were not crude walls of force, but sophisticated systems that could analyze threats at the level of spiritual essence, distinguishing between the righteous and the corrupt with precision that bordered on the divine. The Doomslayer approached these defenses with weapons ready, expecting the kind of resistance he had encountered throughout his passage across the galaxy. Yet as the first ward layer made contact with his consciousness, probing his intentions with tendrils of pure psychic energy, he felt something that gave him pause. This was not the malevolent testing of demon princes or the seductive whispers of chaos entities, but an examination conducted with the careful precision of guardians who sought to protect rather than corrupt. The wards carried within their structure the essence of every soul that had contributed to their creation, and that essence sang with righteous purpose. The psychic barriers did not attack him, but rather sought to understand him, their touch gentle, despite the overwhelming power they represented. Through these defenses spoke the voices of 10,000 years of loyal service. Space Marines who had died defending the throne world, Imperial Guard regiments that had stood against impossible odds, custodians who had maintained their vigil through centuries of warfare, and countless others whose sacrifice had strengthened Terra's protection with each drop of blood spilled in humanity's defense. Their combined will formed a chorus of dedication that resonated with his own absolute purpose in ways that transcended rational understanding. For the first time since beginning his crusade against evil, the Doomslayer encountered resistance that was not born from malevolence, but from love. These defenses had been erected not to conquer or corrupt, not to spread suffering or claim dominion, but to shield innocent lives from the horrors that dwelt in the darkness between stars. The souls that powered these wards had chosen death before dishonor, had accepted annihilation rather than allow evil to pass them by. Their sacrifice had transformed Terra's psychic defenses into something unprecedented in the Imperium, barriers that grew stronger through virtue rather than vice. He lowered his weapons as understanding flooded through his enhanced consciousness. These were not enemies to be destroyed, but allies whose purpose aligned perfectly with his own crusade against the forces of darkness. The wards recognized this kinship and began to shift their configuration, not to grant him passage, but to test his worthiness through trials that would determine whether his claim to righteousness was genuine or merely another deception crafted by the enemies of mankind. The first test came in the form of spectral warriors, the souls of Imperial defenders who had fallen in service to the Golden Throne. They manifested as perfect echoes of their living selves, bearing the weapons and armor they had carried in life, their faces showing the same determination that had driven them to make the ultimate sacrifice for humanity's survival. These were not mindless automatons, but conscious spirits who retained their memories, their loyalties, and their absolute dedication to protecting the innocent from the predations of evil. They challenged him, not with hatred, but with honor, offering him the same tests they had faced in life, the choice between easy victory through compromise and difficult triumph through adherence to principle. Each spectral warrior represented a different aspect of righteous service, from the guardsman who had held his position against overwhelming odds, to the space marine who had charged into certain death to buy civilians time to escape. They fought not to destroy him, but to measure the purity of his purpose against their own unwavering dedication. The Doomslayer met their challenge with respect rather than fury, his weapons speaking not in anger, but in recognition of their shared commitment to the destruction of evil. His chainsaw carved through spectral armor with surgical precision, his shotgun blazed with light that honored their sacrifice even as it tested their resolve. Each battle was a conversation conducted in the language of warriors, a dialogue between souls dedicated to the same cause, expressed through the medium of honorable combat. The spectral defenders fell before his advance, but their defeat brought no diminishment of their essence. Instead, each soul that acknowledged his worthiness added its strength to his own, their righteous purpose joining with his absolute determination to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The wards of terror recognized this synthesis and began to resonate with harmonic frequencies that had not been heard since the Emperor himself had walked among mortals, their crystalline structure adapting to accommodate a presence that embodied the same principles upon which the Imperium had been founded. The second layer of defenses tested his intentions through more subtle means, probing his memories to determine whether his crusade was driven by righteous fury or merely the desire for destruction disguised as virtue. The psychic examination delved into the depths of his consciousness, seeking any trace of the corruption that tainted so many who claimed to serve the cause of good. What it found was a purpose so pure and absolute that it left no room for doubt or compromise, a will that had been refined through 10,000 years of warfare until nothing remained but the fundamental drive to protect the innocent by destroying their enemies. Terra's ancient machine spirits, awakened by the unprecedented nature of this intrusion, added their voices to the examination. These artificial intelligences had served the throne world since before the Unification Wars, their loyalty to humanity programmed at levels so fundamental that even the passage of millennia could not erode their dedication. They analyzed his weapons and armor with sensors that operated across multiple dimensions, cataloging capabilities that defied their understanding of mortal technology, while confirming that every system had been designed and blessed for the singular purpose of annihilating evil. The final barrier opened before him, like the petals of a flower revealing its heart, the layers of psychic defense recognizing him not as an intruder to be repelled, but as a champion whose arrival had been prophesied in the deepest archives of Imperial lore. He emerged from the warp directly above the Imperial Palace, his passage marked by a rift that blazed with light too pure for demon eyes to perceive. The breach in reality stabilized rather than collapsing, creating a permanent gateway between dimensions that radiated the same righteous energy that powered his weapons and armor. The moment of his arrival sent shockwaves through every defensive system that guarded the seat of Imperial power, Auspex arrays that had been calibrated to detect the slightest trace of chaos corruption registered readings that broke their measurement scales, not because evil had penetrated their defenses, but because something of such absolute purity had manifested that their sensors could not properly categorize it. Psychic wards that had repelled the greatest demon princes of the warp welcomed his presence with harmonic resonances that had not been heard since the Great Crusade. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, the Custodian Guard felt the tremor of his arrival through their psychic connection to their master on the Golden Throne. Alert runes blazed to life across command centers that had remained dormant for centuries, their ancient machine spirits awakening to process data streams that carried information about an impossibility made manifest. This was not the familiar sensation of chaos attempting to breach their defenses, but something else entirely. A presence so fundamentally opposed to corruption that it created zones of absolute purity wherever it manifested. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood in the primary command chamber as reports flooded in from every sensor array and defensive position throughout the palace. The readings defied rational analysis. Something had breached the most powerful psychic defenses in the galaxy without triggering a single alarm, had manifested directly above the throne room without activating any of the ancient weapon systems that guarded the Emperor's sanctuary. Yet this intrusion carried no trace of malevolence, no whisper of corruption, no hint of the spiritual contamination that accompanied every demon incursion. The custodians throughout the palace felt their enhanced senses reaching the limits of their ability to process the unprecedented nature of what approached. This was not an enemy seeking to destroy or corrupt, not a rival claimant to their master's throne, not another in the endless succession of threats that had tested their vigilance for 10 millennia. This was something else entirely. A force of nature given consciousness and will, a storm of righteousness that had torn its way across the galaxy to reach the heart of the Imperium's power. Above them, the Doomslayer descended through layers of reality toward the Golden Throne, his weapons blazing with light that hurt demon eyes to perceive, his armor crackling with energy drawn from 10,000 years of righteous slaughter. The hunt that had begun in Hell's deepest pits, that had led him through the dimensional barriers of the warp itself, now approached its culmination in the chamber where humanity's greatest champion maintained his eternal vigil. The galaxy held its breath as two forces of absolute will prepared to meet in the heart of the Imperium, their encounter destined to determine whether the stalemate that had persisted for 10,000 years would finally be broken. The Custodes moved to their battle positions with precision born of endless drill and unwavering dedication, yet uncertainty gnawed at their enhanced minds. Their sensors detected no trace of corruption, their psychic senses perceived no malevolent intent, their master's own emanations carried no warning of approaching danger. They faced an unprecedented decision, whether to defend their emperor against a threat they could not identify, or stand aside for a potential ally whose nature defied their understanding of what was possible in a universe where righteousness and corruption existed in eternal conflict. The Imperial Palace erupted into coordinated chaos as alarms that had remained silent for centuries screamed their warnings across corridors that stretched for kilometers beneath Terra's surface. Ancient Vox systems crackled to life, carrying orders in High Gothic that had not been spoken since the darkest days of the Horus heresy. Blast doors that had been sealed for millennia groaned open to disgorge the golden-armored figures of the Adeptus Custodes, each warrior a masterpiece of gene-craft and training that had taken decades to perfect. They moved with the fluid precision of predators awakening from sleep, their weapons gleaming with power fields that could cleave through the armor of Space Marine Terminators as easily as parchment. Captain General Trajan Valoris led the mobilization from the primary command chamber, his enhanced mind processing hundreds of tactical displays while coordinating the movements of his brotherhood with precision that bordered on telepathic. 10,000 years of vigilance had prepared the Custodes for every conceivable threat to their master's sanctuary, from demon incursions to rebel space marine legions, from Xenos infiltrators to rogue psychers driven mad by contact with the warp. Yet the readings flooding his command center spoke of something entirely outside their accumulated experience, a breach that registered as utterly pure rather than corrupted, a presence that radiated righteous purpose rather than malevolent intent. The Doomslayer descended through the palace's labyrinthine passages with the steady inevitability of a force of nature given direction and will. The ancient architecture that surrounded him spoke of millennia of dedication and sacrifice, every stone carved by craftsmen who had given their lives to create a fortress worthy of humanity's greatest champion. Murals depicting the Emperor's victories during the Great Crusade watched his passage with eyes that seemed to follow his movement, while servo-skulls emerged from alcoves to scan him with auspex arrays that registered readings beyond their ability to interpret. The corridors themselves seemed to guide his steps, ancient machine spirits recognizing something in his purpose that resonated with their own programming to protect and serve. Doors that should have remained sealed swung open at his approach, while defensive systems that could have reduced him to atoms simply tracked his movement without engaging. The palace's own consciousness, accumulated through 10,000 years of loyal service and unwavering dedication, sensed in him a kindred spirit whose absolute commitment to the destruction of evil matched the devotion that had built these sacred halls. He encountered the first custodian patrol at the intersection of 7 passages, their golden forms emerging from concealment with weapons trained upon him before he had taken another step. These were not the crude ambush tactics of lesser warriors, but the coordinated movement of guardians who had spent centuries perfecting their craft. Guardian spears crackling with disruptor fields formed a barrier of death that could have stopped a charging land raider, while storm bolters loaded with sanctified ammunition tracked his center of mass with targeting systems that never missed their intended target. Yet something stayed their hands in the moment, before violence erupted. The lead custodian, his helmet's sensor array ablaze with scanning beams, spoke a single word in the ancient tongue of terror that had not been heard for millennia. Purity. His weapons remained trained upon the intruder, but uncertainty flickered across his enhanced features like shadows cast by a dying flame. Every scan, every auspex reading, every psychic probe confirmed the impossible. This armored figure radiated the same absolute dedication to righteousness that drove their own service to the Golden Throne. The Doomslayer stood motionless as they examined him, his weapons lowered but ready, his purpose blazing like a beacon that could be perceived across multiple dimensions. He spoke no words, for his nature required no explanation beyond what their enhanced senses could detect. Here was a warrior whose dedication to the destruction of evil matched their own commitment to protecting humanity's greatest champion. The custodians felt the weight of his gaze through his helmet's visor, recognizing something in those hidden eyes that spoke of 10,000 years spent in service to the same cause that defined their existence. The standoff stretched across subjective eternities as more custodians arrived to reinforce their brothers, their golden armor gleaming in the palace's eternal twilight, while their weapons formed killing fields that could have stopped a demon prince. Shield Captain Tyvar Aurelius emerged from a side passage, his storm shield blazing with protective energies, while his guardian spear hummed with barely contained violence. His enhanced senses analyzed the intruder from every possible angle, seeking some flaw or deception that would justify the application of lethal force. What he found instead was a purpose so pure and absolute that it left no room for corruption or compromise. The green-armored figure before them had been tested by the palace's own defenses and found worthy, had passed through psychic barriers that would have destroyed any servant of chaos instantly, had manifested in the heart of Terra's protection without triggering a single warning about spiritual contamination. Yet he remained an unknown factor, a variable that their 10 millennia of training had not prepared them to address. Behind them, deeper in the palace's sacred depths, more custodians took positions along the approach routes to the throne room. These were the companions, the most elite of an already peerless brotherhood, warriors who had stood in the Emperor's presence and been deemed worthy of his personal attention. They moved through corridors they had walked for centuries, taking positions they had held against every conceivable threat, preparing to defend their master against something that defied categorization as either enemy or ally. The Doomslayer began to advance, not with the aggressive rush of an attacker, but with the measured pace of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. Each step sent ripples through the palace's psychic defenses, not weakening them, but causing them to resonate with harmonic frequencies that spoke of shared purpose and common cause. The custodians tracked his movement with weapons that could have reduced him to constituent atoms, yet something in his bearing stayed their hands. This was, "You stand in the presence of the master of mankind," Valoris spoke, his voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of unwavering service. "State your purpose, stranger, or know that your next step will be your last." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, imbued with the psychic resonance of absolute loyalty and the backing of the most elite warriors humanity had ever produced. Yet even as he issued the challenge, uncertainty gnawed at his enhanced consciousness. Every instinct developed through millennia of service told him that this figure posed no threat to his master, while every protocol demanded that he treat any intrusion as hostile until proven otherwise. The Doomslayer's response came not in words, but in action. He reached toward his weapons, causing every custodian in the corridor to tense in preparation for battle, their targeting systems locking onto vital points, while their power fields blazed with lethal energy. Yet instead of drawing his weapons for battle, he deliberately placed them upon the ancient stone of the palace floor, the blessed armaments clattering with metallic echoes that seemed to carry their own meaning in the sacred silence of the Emperor's halls. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled custodians. This was not the action of an enemy preparing for battle or a mad man seeking martyrdom, but something else entirely. The calculated move of a warrior who sought audience rather than conflict, who offered peace to those he recognized as servants of the same cause that drove his own crusade. His weapons lay before him like offerings upon an altar, their blessed surfaces gleaming with power, drawn from 10,000 years of righteous slaughter, yet rendered harmless by his conscious choice. Shield Captain Aurelius felt his targeting systems wavering as his enhanced mind struggled to process the implications of what he witnessed. Here was a being who had breached every defense the Imperium possessed, who had manifested in the heart of Terra's protection without triggering a single corruption warning, who now offered himself defenseless before the guardians of humanity's greatest champion. The gesture spoke of respect rather than submission, of recognition rather than surrender, of something approaching reverence for the being who dwelt beyond the sealed doors of the throne room. The golden-armored warriors of the Adeptus Custodes faced a decision that no amount of training or tactical doctrine could resolve. Their duty was absolute, to defend their master against all threats, to stand as an unbreachable wall between him and anything that sought to cause harm. Yet their enhanced senses detected no malevolence. Their psychic awareness perceived no corruption. Their sophisticated equipment registered nothing but absolute purity of purpose. They stood at the threshold of an unprecedented moment. Their weapons trained upon a figure who might represent either the greatest threat or the most profound ally their vigil had ever encountered. In the depths of the palace, ancient systems stirred as the Emperor's own consciousness touched the situation unfolding in his outer chambers. The Golden Throne's psychic emanations carried subtle shifts in emphasis that only the most experienced custodians could detect, frequencies that spoke of attention, focused not in alarm but in something approaching anticipation. Their master was aware of the intruder's presence, was analyzing the unprecedented nature of what approached his sanctuary, was preparing to make a judgment that would determine the fate of more than just the immediate confrontation. The Doomslayer stood disarmed before the assembled might of humanity's greatest guardians, his purpose blazing like a star in the depths of their enhanced perception, while his actions spoke of respect for the sanctity of the place he had sought across 10,000 years of warfare. The hunt that had begun in hell's deepest pits, that had led him through the dimensional barriers of the warp itself, now approached its moment of culmination in a corridor where two forces of absolute dedication faced each other across the narrow space between duty and recognition, between protocol and unprecedented possibility. From the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace, where the Golden Throne maintained its eternal vigil over humanity's scattered children, a presence vast and ancient, beyond mortal comprehension, stirred to full wakefulness. The master of mankind, he whose psychic might had once blazed across the galaxy like a second sun, focused the totality of his attention upon the unprecedented scene unfolding in his outer chambers. For 10,000 years, he had remained bound to the arcane machinery that kept the Astronomicon burning bright, his consciousness spread thin across the void to guide humanity's ships through the darkness between stars. Yet now he gathered that infinite awareness into a single point of crystalline focus, bringing to bear a psychic probe that could have scoured entire worlds clean of life. The examination began not with violence, but with the gentle touch of a mind that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, that had seen the rise and fall of species across the breadth of the galaxy, that had shepherded humanity through its darkest hours with patience born of absolute love. The Emperor's consciousness touched the edges of the Doomslayer's awareness like light falling upon still water, seeking not to invade or dominate, but to understand the nature of the being who had carved a path of righteousness through the very heart of chaos itself. What he found defied every precedent in his vast experience of mortal consciousness. Here was a mind that had been refined through 10 millennia of warfare until nothing remained but absolute purpose. A will that had been tested by every form of corruption the universe could devise, and emerged not merely unbroken, but purified to its essential core. The Seraphim's blessing had created something unprecedented, a mortal soul that burned with such intensity that it could walk through the warp itself without suffering the slightest taint, that could face the whispers of gods and respond with nothing but violence so pure it left no room for doubt or compromise. The psychic probe delved deeper into the Slayer's memories, witnessing visions of a crusade that spanned dimensions and defied the natural order of existence. The Emperor saw the first moment of transformation in the divinity machine, when blessed energy had flooded mortal flesh and elevated it beyond the limitations of ordinary humanity. He witnessed 10,000 years of battle against the legions of hell, each victory adding to a legend that grew more terrible with every daemon that fell before righteous fury. He observed the moment of breakthrough into the warp, when the Slayer had chosen to pursue evil into its deepest sanctuary, rather than accept the boundaries that had contained lesser warriors. Through the Slayer's experiences, the Emperor perceived battles that challenged his understanding of what was possible, even for beings of supernatural power. He watched as demon princes fell like wheat before the scythe, as greater demons that had terrorized galaxies were reduced to scattered essence by weapons that blazed with absolute conviction. He witnessed the systematic dismantling of chaos strongholds that had endured since before the birth of stars, saw corridors of the warp transformed from howling madness into crystallized order through the simple application of unwavering will. Yet beneath the endless catalogue of victories, the Emperor sensed something else that resonated with his own ancient burden. This was not a warrior who fought from hatred or the desire for glory, but one driven by the same fundamental imperative that had shaped his own existence, the absolute necessity of protecting innocent life from the predations of evil. The Slayer's fury was not born from personal grievance, but from witnessing what corruption could do to those who lacked the strength to defend themselves. His crusade was fueled not by rage, but by love, by a commitment to preservation that expressed itself through the systematic destruction of everything that threatened the innocent. The recognition struck both beings simultaneously, a moment of understanding that transcended the barriers between mortal and divine consciousness. Here were two souls forged in the same fundamental fire, shaped by the same absolute dedication to a cause that demanded everything they possessed and more. The Emperor felt echoes of his own ancient choice to accept the burden of the Golden Throne, to sacrifice personal freedom for the greater good, to endure infinite suffering so that humanity might survive the darkness that surrounded them on every side. In that moment of perfect communion, the barriers between their minds dissolved entirely. The Emperor experienced the Slayer's 10,000 years of warfare as if they were his own memories, felt the weight of every daemon destroyed and every innocent soul avenged. In return, the Slayer glimpsed the vast scope of the Emperor's sacrifice, the agonies endured to maintain the Astronomicon, the terrible loneliness of bearing responsibility for an entire species while trapped within a failing shell of flesh and bone. The Golden Throne itself resonated with harmonic frequencies that had not been heard since the darkest days of the Horus Heresy, its ancient systems responding to their occupants' emotional state with mechanisms that had lain dormant for millennia. Power readings fluctuated across measurement scales as the Emperor's psychic emanations reached levels that had not been recorded since he had walked among mortals, as conqueror and unifier. Yet this was not the blazing fury of the God Emperor in battle, but something deeper and more profound, the recognition of a kindred spirit whose dedication matched his own. The Custodes throughout the palace felt the change like a physical shock, their enhanced senses reeling from the sudden intensity of their master's psychic presence. Captain General Valoris staggered as visions flooded his consciousness unbidden, images of the green-armored warriors' crusade streaming directly from the Emperor's examination. He saw demon legions falling like autumn leaves, witnessed chaos strongholds reduced to crystallized order, observed 10,000 years of absolute dedication to the destruction of evil in all its forms. Shield Captain Aurelius felt his guardian spear wavering in hands that had never trembled in 10 centuries of service, his targeting systems unable to maintain lock on a figure that his master's own consciousness had touched with something approaching reverence. The psychic resonance from the throne room carried overtones of recognition and acceptance, emotions that spoke of a judgment rendered and a decision made. Their Emperor, silent for so long that many had wondered if he retained the capacity for communication, was preparing to speak. The command came not in words, but in pure understanding that flooded the minds of every custodian simultaneously. It carried the weight of absolute authority, combined with something that transcended mere orders, the gentle certainty of a father guiding his children toward wisdom they could not yet comprehend. The weapons of the Adeptus Custodes lowered not in surrender, but in recognition, their golden forms stepping aside to create a clear path toward the chamber where their master maintained his eternal vigil. Shield Captain Tyvar Aurelius was the first to fully process the implications of what he had witnessed through his psychic connection to the Golden Throne. Here was not an enemy to be destroyed or an intruder to be repelled, but something far more precious and unprecedented, an ally whose dedication to the cause of righteousness matched their own absolute loyalty, the readings their sensors had provided, the purity their enhanced senses had detected, the absolute absence of corruption their psychic probes had confirmed. All of it spoke to a single truth that defied every protocol they had learned, but aligned perfectly with the purpose that defined their existence. The Doomslayer felt the weight of divine attention, like warmth after endless cold, recognition after millennia of solitary warfare, understanding after eons of being the only consciousness in existence that burned with such absolute purpose. The Emperor's examination had not been an interrogation, but a confirmation, not a test of worthiness, but an acknowledgement of kinship. In that moment of perfect communion, he understood that his hunt across dimensions had led him not to another battlefield, but to something he had never dared hope to find. Another soul that shared his burden and his dedication. The psychic pressure in the corridors began to shift as the Emperor's consciousness withdrew from direct contact. Yet the connection remained, like a golden thread binding two minds that had recognized their fundamental unity. The ancient machinery of the Golden Throne hummed with harmonics that spoke of anticipation rather than vigilance, preparation rather than defense. Something was about to change in the eternal stalemate that had defined the galaxy for 10,000 years, a shift in the balance of power that would ripple across both dimensions. Captain General Valoris straightened from his momentary disorientation, his enhanced mind processing the full implications of what he had witnessed through his psychic bond with his master. The orders flowing through his consciousness carried nuances that spoke of unprecedented circumstances requiring unprecedented responses. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Custodian Guard was being commanded not to defend, but to welcome, not to repel, but to escort, not to preserve the status quo, but to facilitate change that might alter the very nature of humanity's war against chaos. The Doomslayer retrieved his weapons, with movements that carried the weight of ritual, each gesture observed by the assembled custodians with understanding born of their master's recognition. These were not the tools of conquest, but the instruments of service, blessed armaments dedicated to the same cause that had shaped their own existence. The green-armored figure who had breached every defense they possessed was revealed not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a champion whose arrival marked the beginning of a new phase in the eternal war. The Golden Guardians of humanity's greatest leader stepped aside with precision that spoke of absolute discipline, combined with something approaching reverence. Their formation created not a gauntlet of weapons, but an honor guard, warriors acknowledging the passage of one whose dedication to righteousness had been tested by the master of mankind himself and found worthy. The path to the throne room lay open, illuminated by light that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the ancient palace. In the deepest chamber of the imperial sanctum, where the Golden Throne maintained its vigil over the scattered children of humanity, the Emperor prepared to meet face to face with the only other consciousness in existence that truly understood the weight of infinite responsibility. The hunt that had begun in hell's deepest pits was approaching its culmination, not in battle but in recognition, not in conquest but in alliance, not in ending but in beginning. Two forces of absolute will were about to stand in the same chamber, their combined dedication to the destruction of evil sufficient to tip the balance in a war that had raged for 10,000 years without resolution. The throne room of the master of mankind stretched before the Doomslayer like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of sacrifice itself, its dimensions defying mortal comprehension as golden walls soared upward into shadows that seemed to contain the weight of eternity. Ancient machinery hummed with power that had sustained the greatest psyker in human history for 10,000 years. Massive cogitators processing data streams that flowed from every corner of the galaxy, while the Astronomicon blazed with light that could be perceived across dimensional barriers. This was not merely a chamber, but a nexus where the fate of humanity was decided, with each labored breath of the being who sat upon the artifact that had become both throne and prison. At the heart of this vast space, elevated upon a dais that rose like a mountain of golden artifice, sat the Emperor of mankind in all his terrible majesty. The millennia had not been kind to his physical form, reducing what had once been the pinnacle of human perfection to something barely recognizable as mortal flesh. His body was more machine than man now, sustained by arcane technologies that fed nutrients directly into his bloodstream, while psychic amplifiers channeled his consciousness across the void to maintain the beacon that guided humanity's ships through the darkness between stars. Yet despite the ravages of time and the toll of constant sacrifice, His presence filled the chamber with power that made reality itself seem fragile by comparison. The Doomslayer approached with weapons lowered but ready, each step echoing through acoustics designed to carry the whispers of gods. His enhanced senses registered defensive systems that could have reduced entire armies to constituent atoms, weapon arrays that tracked his movement with targeting systems that never missed their intended target, psychic barriers that tested his intentions with every breath he drew. Yet none of these safeguards activated, for the being upon the golden throne had already rendered judgment and found him worthy of approach. As he drew closer to the dais, the full scope of the Emperor's sacrifice became clear to his enhanced perception. Here was a consciousness vast enough to encompass the protection of an entire species, a will strong enough to hold back the tides of chaos through sheer determination, a love deep enough to endure infinite agony for the sake of those who would never know his name or understand the price paid for their survival. The Golden Throne was not merely a seat of power, but an instrument of torture. Each moment of existence a choice to endure unimaginable suffering rather than abandon humanity to the darkness that pressed against them from every side. The Emperor's eyes, still burning with the fire that had once blazed across the galaxy during the Great Crusade, fixed upon the approaching figure with attention that seemed to strip away every pretense and examine the very essence of his being. Yet there was no judgment in that gaze, no suspicion or wariness, but something far more profound, recognition of a kindred spirit whose dedication matched his own absolute commitment to the preservation of innocent life. In those ancient eyes, the Doomslayer saw reflected his own 10,000 years of warfare, his own choice to bear an infinite burden rather than allow evil to triumph through his inaction. The psychic communion that began between them transcended the limitations of mortal language, minds touching across the vast gulf that separated human and post-human consciousness. The Emperor's thoughts carried the weight of civilizations. The accumulated wisdom of species that had risen and fallen before humanity had learned to kindle fire, the terrible knowledge of what awaited any race that faltered in its vigilance against chaos. Yet beneath the cosmic scope of his awareness lay something utterly human, the pain of a father who had watched his children turn against each other, the grief of a protector who had been forced to choose between competing evils, the loneliness of bearing responsibility that no other consciousness could truly comprehend. In return, the Slayer's mind offered its own catalogue of sacrifice and dedication, 10 millennia spent in dimensions where hope itself had been corrupted into a weapon against the innocent. The Emperor experienced the Slayer's memories as if they were his own, the moment of transformation in the divinity machine, the first daemon to fall before righteous fury, the endless succession of victories against odds that should have been impossible to overcome. He felt the weight of every soul avenged, every innocent protected through the systematic destruction of their tormentors, every choice to continue fighting when surrender would have brought peace. The communication deepened as both beings recognized the fundamental similarity of their existence. Here were two souls that had been shaped by the same cosmic imperative, the absolute necessity of standing against evil, regardless of personal cost. The Emperor had accepted the burden of the Golden Throne to preserve humanity's future, while the Slayer had embraced transformation beyond mortality to wage war against corruption in all its forms. Both had sacrificed everything that made existence bearable in order to fulfill purposes that demanded nothing less than absolute dedication. Through their psychic connection, the Doomslayer glimpsed the true scope of the Emperor's vigil, the constant strain of maintaining the Astronomicon while simultaneously holding back the predations of chaos through sheer force of will. He saw how each day brought fresh challenges that required divine intervention, how the Imperium's survival depended entirely upon a being whose consciousness was stretched to the breaking point across 1,000 different crises. The weight of such responsibility would have crushed any mortal mind, yet the Emperor bore it with the same unwavering determination that had driven the Slayer's crusade through the depths of hell itself. The Emperor, in turn, perceived the true nature of the war that had shaped his unexpected visitor. Through the Slayer's memories, he witnessed battles that challenged his understanding of what was possible even for beings of supernatural power. He saw the systematic dismantling of demon legions that had terrorized galaxies, watched as greater demons fell like wheat before weapons that blazed with absolute conviction, observed the transformation of chaos strongholds into zones of crystallized order through the simple application of unwavering will. Here was a warrior whose dedication to the destruction of evil matched his own commitment to the preservation of good. The recognition that flowed between them carried implications that would reshape the balance of power in a war that had raged without resolution for 10,000 years. The Emperor had maintained his vigil alone, sustained by nothing but his love for humanity, and his refusal to abandon them to the darkness that surrounded them on every side. The Slayer, "Join me in this vigil." The words resonated through psychic channels that bypassed the air and spoke directly to the soul. And no peace in service that transcends the individual will. Or continue your hunt with my blessing, carrying my light into realms where even my sight cannot penetrate. Either path serves the same cause, upholds the same purpose, protects the same precious flame that evil seeks to extinguish. Choose not as my servant, but as my brother in arms, for you have earned the right to forge your own destiny through 10,000 years of unwavering dedication. The offer hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning the gulf between mortal and divine consciousness. The Emperor was proposing not subordination, but partnership, not the absorption of the Slayer's will into his own, but the recognition of two forces working toward identical goals through different means. The choice was genuine: remain on Terra and add his strength to the eternal vigil that protected humanity from within, or return to the dimensions of chaos with the Emperor's blessing and wage war against corruption from without. The Doomslayer felt the weight of decision settle upon his consciousness like armor forged from the substance of destiny itself. For the first time in 10,000 years, he was offered something other than endless warfare. The possibility of rest, of comradeship, of sharing the burden that had defined his existence since the moment of his transformation. The temptation was real and profound, the promise of standing beside another consciousness that understood the price of absolute dedication, more appealing than any offer he had ever received. Yet even as he considered the Emperor's proposal, his enhanced senses detected the psychic disturbances that constantly pressed against Terra's defenses. Demon legions prowled the edges of the Sol system, seeking weakness they could exploit to strike at humanity's heart. Chaos cults throughout the galaxy plotted rebellion and corruption, their activities temporarily disrupted by his passage through the warp, but not permanently ended. The war against evil required warriors on every front, and his talents were perhaps best suited to the hunt rather than the vigil. The Emperor sensed the direction of his thoughts, and nodded with understanding that transcended the need for spoken words. This was not disappointment, but recognition of a choice that honored both their purposes. The hunt would continue, but it would no longer be a solitary crusade waged in dimensions where hope had been forgotten. Now it would be part of something larger, a coordinated effort between two forces of absolute will working toward the same ultimate goal through different methods. The psychic communion between them crystallized into something approaching a sacred compact, a bond forged not through oaths or ceremonies, but through mutual recognition of shared purpose and absolute trust. The Emperor's blessing flowed through dimensions like liquid fire, empowering weapons that had already proven capable of permanent destruction, sanctifying armor that had protected its wearer through battles against impossible odds. This was not merely divine favor, but the partnership of equals united in common cause. The golden light of the Astronomicon pulsed with rhythms that had not been heard since the Great Crusade, its beacon carrying new harmonics that would guide more than ships through the darkness between stars. The alliance forged in this moment would create ripples across both dimensions, a shift in the eternal war that would be felt by every demon prince and chaos god that had thought themselves secure in their dominion over corruption itself. As the Doomslayer prepared to depart the chamber, where he had found brotherhood with the only other consciousness that could truly understand his burden, both warriors knew that the galaxy itself was about to witness the beginning of a new chapter in humanity's struggle for survival. The hunt would continue, but it would no longer be a desperate holding action against inevitable defeat. Now it would be the coordinated campaign of two forces whose combined dedication to the destruction of evil might finally bring an end to the darkness that had threatened innocent life since the dawn of consciousness itself. Word of the unprecedented alliance spread through the ranks of the Adeptus Custodes like ripples across still water, carried not through spoken communication, but through the psychic resonance that bound every member of the Brotherhood to their master's will. Throughout, Imperial commanders across 1,000 worlds reported phenomena that defied every precedent in their accumulated experience. Warp storms that had raged for centuries simply dissipated overnight. Demon incursions that suddenly collapsed without explanation. Chaos cults whose elaborate rituals failed to manifest even the most basic supernatural effects. The pattern was consistent across every sector, every segmentum, every distant outpost where Imperial forces maintained their eternal vigil against the darkness. Navigator houses throughout the Imperium convened emergency sessions as their most experienced practitioners reported changes in the Imperium that challenged 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom. The familiar currents of psychic energy that had defined warp travel since before the birth of the Astronomicon were shifting, becoming more stable and predictable than anyone had dared imagine possible. Trade greater Nurgle's plague-bearers, patient as entropy itself, fled from zones of crystallized purity that negated their very essence. Tzeentch's horrors, masters of fate and possibility, discovered that their elaborate schemes collapsed into certainty when confronted by will so absolute it left no room for alternative outcomes. Slaanesh's daemonettes, perfection made manifest, recoiled from encounters with purpose so pure it offered no purchase for their seductive corruption. The four chaos gods themselves felt the shift like a wound that would not heal, a disruption in the fundamental order of the warp that threatened the very foundation of their existence. For eons they had fed on the emotions and fears of mortal minds, growing stronger with each soul that fell to corruption, each civilization that embraced damnation rather than face extinction. Yet now, Spaceman Automat the Alliance. In the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace, ancient servo-skulls activated systems that had remained dormant since the Great Crusade, their machine spirits responding to changes in their master's psychic emanations that indicated a fundamental shift in strategic priorities. Tactical cogitators began processing scenarios that assumed active offensive operations against chaos rather than the purely defensive stance that had defined Imperial doctrine for 10 millennia. For the first time since the Horus Heresy, humanity's greatest protector was contemplating not mere survival, but the possibility of genuine victory against the forces that threatened innocent life across the galaxy. The Doomslayer, blessed with divine authority and empowered by weapons that had proven capable of permanent destruction, had returned to the hunt with purpose that burned brighter than ever before. His passage through the warp left zones of crystallized order that would endure long after he had moved on to other battlefields, permanent alterations to the Imperium's structure that spoke of fundamental changes in the nature of reality itself. The war between order and chaos had entered a new phase, one where the outcome was no longer predetermined by the seeming inevitability of corruption and decay. Yet the Custodes, Those golden guardians who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations understood that hope was a dangerous luxury in a universe where evil never rested, and victory was always temporary. They maintained their vigil with the same unwavering dedication they had shown for 10,000 years, their weapons ready, their purpose unwavering, their loyalty absolute. The alliance their master had forged offered the possibility of genuine progress in humanity's eternal struggle, but it also meant that the stakes had never been higher or the consequences of failure more catastrophic. The galaxy held its breath as the implications of the unprecedented partnership continued to unfold, while in the depths of both dimensions, forces of absolute will prepared to wage a war that would determine whether corruption truly was inevitable, or whether righteousness could triumph through sufficient dedication and sacrifice. The hunt continued, but it was no longer a solitary crusade waged in the darkness between dimensions. Now it was part of something larger, a coordinated campaign between mortal and divine consciousness working toward the same ultimate goal, the protection of innocent life through the systematic destruction of everything that threatened its existence. The departure from Terra came not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet dignity that marked all transitions between eternal duties. The Doomslayer stood once more in the chamber, where the master of mankind maintained his vigil, weapons blessed with divine authority, crackling with energies that had been sanctified by direct contact with the most powerful psyker in human history. The golden throne pulsed with harmonics that spoke of anticipation rather than farewell. For this was not an ending, but the beginning of a coordinated campaign that would span both dimensions and challenge the fundamental nature of evil itself. The Emperor's final blessing flowed through psychic channels that bypassed the limitations of mortal communication, carrying within its essence the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years spent in service to humanity's survival. This was more than mere empowerment of weapons and armor, more than the sanctification of purpose that had already driven the Slayer's crusade through the depths of hell. It was the sharing of burden between two consciousnesses that understood the true cost of absolute dedication, the weight of responsibility that could never be laid down while innocent souls remained threatened by corruption and damnation. Through their connection, the Doomslayer felt the scope of vigilance that the Emperor maintained across the galaxy, the constant strain of guiding humanity's ships through the darkness, while simultaneously holding back the predations of chaos through sheer force of will. In return, the Emperor glimpsed the infinite battlefield that awaited in the depths of the Imperium, the endless legions of demons that pressed against the barriers between dimensions, seeking weakness they could exploit to pour into real space and claim innocent lives for their dark masters. Their purposes aligned not in hierarchy, but in partnership, two aspects of the same fundamental mission, executed through different means. The Custodes who witnessed his departure did so not as guards watching a potential threat leave their domain, but as warriors acknowledging the passage of an ally whose dedication matched their own unwavering loyalty. Captain General Valoris inclined his head in a gesture that carried the weight of respect earned through unprecedented circumstances, while Shield Captain Aurelius and his brothers formed an honor guard that escorted the green-armored figure through corridors they had defended for millennia. Their weapons remained ready, not from suspicion, but from habit, born of eternal vigilance, their golden armor gleaming in the palace's twilight as they fulfilled the ancient protocols of their brotherhood. The rift that opened above the imperial palace blazed with light too pure for demon eyes to perceive, a gateway between dimensions that radiated the same righteous energy that powered the Astronomicon. This was not the crude tear in reality that marked demon incursions or warp storms, but a carefully crafted passage that spoke of divine will made manifest through mortal determination. The breach stabilized rather than collapsing, creating a permanent connection that would allow swift passage between real space and the Imperium, while remaining sealed to any influence that did not carry the Emperor's blessing. The Doomslayer stepped through this gateway, not as an exile departing familiar shores, but as a champion returning to his chosen battlefield, with purpose refined by divine sanction. The warp that greeted his arrival was subtly different from the realm he had first entered 10,000 years before, its chaotic currents tempered by zones of crystallized order that marked the path of his previous passage. Where his weapons had spoken, reality maintained its grip against the fluid madness of the Imperium. Where his purpose had blazed, corruption found no purchase in dimensions that had been purified through the systematic application of righteous fury. The demons that sensed his return felt terror that transcended their immortal nature, fear born not from the possibility of temporary banishment, but from the certainty of permanent ending. The green-armored destroyer had evolved beyond their ability to comprehend or counter, blessed with authority that allowed him to impose consequences that violated every principle they understood about the nature of existence in the warp. His weapons now carried more than the power of his own determination. They bore the sanctified will of the Emperor himself, channeled through armaments that had been forged in the crucible of absolute dedication. Lesser demons fled before his advance, like shadows fleeing the dawn, their forms dissolving back into the psychic medium that comprised their being, rather than face weapons that could carve permanent scars in their essential nature. Greater demons retreated to the deepest layers of their patron god's realms, abandoning strongholds they had held since before the birth of stars, rather than confront an opponent whose power grew with every victory. The systematic nature of their withdrawal spoke not of tactical wisdom, but of primal terror at facing something that challenged the very foundation of their existence. Yet the Doomslayer's mission had evolved beyond the simple destruction of individual targets, expanded by divine blessing to encompass a broader vision of what victory might mean in a war that had raged without resolution for eons. Each demon destroyed weakened the hold that chaos maintained over both dimensions. Every stronghold cleansed created zones of stability that would endure long after he had moved to other battlefields. His passage through the Imperium was transforming the very nature of the realm, imposing order on chaos through the systematic application of blessed violence that left no corner untouched by righteous purpose. The four chaos gods, those ancient entities that had fed on mortal emotion since before the first star ignited, found their realm contracting as zones of crystallized order spread like an infection through their domain. They had ruled the warp through the inevitable corruption of hope into despair, love into obsession, courage into rage, wisdom into cunning. Yet now they faced something that offered no purchase for such transformation, a will so pure and absolute that it created deserts of certainty in their ocean of possibility, regions where their influence simply could not penetrate. In real space, the effects continued to ripple outward as Imperial forces across the galaxy reported phenomena that defied 10,000 years of accumulated tactical doctrine, chaos incursions that should have required entire Space Marine chapters to contain simply dissipated as their supernatural support was severed at the source. Heretical uprisings collapsed without the demonic reinforcement their leaders had counted upon, leaving PDF forces to face enemies reduced to mortal strength and mundane weapons. The balance of power in humanity's eternal war was shifting in ways that offered genuine hope for the first time since the Emperor had taken his place upon the Golden Throne. Navigator houses reported trade routes opening through regions of the warp that had been impassable since the Age of Strife, their psychic senses detecting corridors of stability that allowed unprecedented speed of travel between distant worlds. Astropathic choirs sang with harmonics that carried messages across the galaxy with clarity that made communication almost instantaneous, their voices no longer competing with the screaming of demon legions, but traveling through dimensions that had been purified through systematic application of righteous violence. The very infrastructure of the Imperium was being strengthened by changes that reached to the foundation of how humanity interacted with the psychic realm. On Terra, the Emperor felt the weight of his vigil lighten not through abandonment of responsibility, but through the sharing of burden with another consciousness that understood the true cost of absolute dedication. The Golden Throne's systems registered subtle changes in their occupants' condition, power readings stabilizing at levels that had not been recorded for centuries. The Astronomicon blazed with renewed strength, its beacon carrying harmonics that spoke of coordination between allied forces working toward the same ultimate goal through different methods. The Custodes maintained their eternal watch with the same unwavering dedication they had shown for 10,000 years, yet their vigil was tempered by something that had been absent from their duty for millennia, the knowledge that their master no longer bore his burden alone. Captain General Valoris stood in the observation chamber, above the throne room, his enhanced senses monitoring reports from across the galaxy, while processing the implications of an alliance that had already begun to reshape the fundamental nature of the war against chaos. In the depths of the Imperium, the Doomslayer established patterns of operation that would define his mission for the eons to come. His passage through demon-held territories left zones of crystallized order that expanded outward like ripples on a pond, permanent alterations to the warp structure that created safe passages for Imperial ships while denying sanctuary to the forces of corruption. Each victory built upon the last, creating a network of stability that challenged the very concept of chaos as an inevitable force of nature. The hunt had evolved beyond personal vendetta or individual crusade into something approaching divine mission, blessed with authority that transformed every battle into a sacrament of purification. Yet the essential nature of the conflict remained unchanged, good and evil locked in eternal struggle, with the fate of innocent souls hanging in the balance. The alliance between Emperor and Champion had altered the terms of engagement, but not the fundamental stakes, had provided new weapons and tactics, but not the promise of easy victory. The two eternal warriors, one bound to his golden throne in service to humanity's survival, the other free to range across dimensions in pursuit of evil's destruction, bore their infinite burdens with the same unwavering determination that had defined their existence since the moment they had chosen duty over personal comfort. Their partnership had created possibilities that neither could have achieved alone, had opened pathways to victory that had seemed impossible when the war was waged in isolation. The galaxy watched and waited as the implications of this unprecedented alliance continued to unfold, while in the deepest reaches of both dimensions, forces of absolute will waged war against corruption, with weapons blessed by divine authority and purpose sanctified through 10,000 years of unwavering service. The eternal conflict had entered a new phase, one where hope was no longer a luxury that led inevitably to disappointment, but a weapon that could be wielded with the same deadly precision as any blessed armament. Yet even as victories mounted and demon strongholds fell before the coordinated assault of mortal and divine purpose, both warriors understood the true nature of the burden they had chosen to bear. This was not a war that could be won through single decisive battles or temporary victories, but an eternal struggle that would continue as long as conscious minds existed to dream of corruption or innocence. Their alliance had shifted the balance of power, but not eliminated the fundamental threat, had provided new hope, but not the promise of final rest. The Doomslayer pressed deeper into the maze of madness that comprised the Imperium's heart, his weapons blazing with light that hurt demon eyes to perceive, his purpose burning like a star in the depths of ultimate darkness. Behind him stretched corridors of crystallized order that would guide Imperial ships for generations to come, while ahead lay battles that would determine whether righteousness could triumph through sufficient application of blessed violence. The hunt continued, would always continue. For in a universe where evil never rested, neither could those who stood against it.